Tell me about this. Russian spies are targeting organizations that are trying to develop a coronavirus vaccine in 3 countries, the UK, US, and Canada, and security services are saying this is a danger. Help me out with this, because if I understand this correctly, the private companies who develop a vaccine are going to spend a lot of money on it, even if some of it is government funded. There's some real value here. If Russian spies were able to rip these things off, can they rip them off sufficiently that somebody else can make copycat versions of the same product and then undercut the very private companies that we expect to come up with these treatments?
Yeah, certainly. Just being able to produce the vaccine, Russia probably has the capacity and the capabilities of producing vaccines. But what they haven't done is spent all the money that all these companies in the U.S. and the UK and the rest of the world have spent into finding these vaccines, finding the components that they're being used, and then running them through all 3 phases of the trials. So that's a lot of money that they wouldn't have to spend if they're able to hack all these companies and find out what they're all doing.
And if they found that information, is there enough? I mean, what do you have to steal? The secret formula, and then somebody in a lab is capable of duplicating it without doing all the research?
Well, the basic science of a vaccine is actually pretty well understood, and it's pretty widely understood. You either use a dead virus or an attenuated virus, or you use a component from the virus and you put that in a suspension and inject that into somebody. That's pretty well understood by everyone. But the more proprietary information is which component do you use, which segment of mRNA, or whether or not you use an attenuated or a dead virus. Those are all decisions that each company has to make. And if you're talking about the mRNA strand, you can use any segment of that, and then the decision of which segment to use, that's the proprietary thing. That's the thing that's being tested.
I always wonder why doctors insist on using attenuated when I have to then explain to the listeners that means weakened, right? Why don't they just call it a weakened virus?
We went to school to learn big words.
And so, I mean, you got to get some good out of that degree somehow. But, I mean, seriously, I even understand that. I think Martha Washington, the wife of our first president, understood at least the basics of how to protect. And in fact, what was it, smallpox that she was protecting American troops and did it to herself? And it was a very crude method of doing it back then, but it helped us beat the British. So, hey, it worked at the end of the day. I mean, we all understand that. But like you said, the particulars of which one do you use? How much do you use? What's the process? Is there something special about how you develop that virus and which one of the RNA chains? Are we going to be able to protect this stuff so that because what I don't want to see is I don't want to see private companies who come up with and spend all the money, all the time and effort of all those smart people in white lab coats coming up with this good stuff that's going to help protect us against China virus, only to have it ripped off by the Russians. And what would they do with it other than use it on their own population?
They would use it on their own population, but it would be a huge propaganda win, which Russia really needs right now. And in fact, I believe it was today or earlier this week, one of their top officials said that they believe that they're in a good place to develop or to produce 30 million doses by the end of this year. That's a pretty bold claim. Over here, we're pretty optimistic, but we're saying that we might have a vaccine by the end of the year. Over there, they're saying that they already have, or that they will have it. So being that that's the case, and they're only developing 1 or 2 vaccines, as far as I can tell, it'd be in their best propaganda interest for them to go and steal the work of other people so that they have something at the end of this.
Well, and Doctor, is there another piece to this too? As I understand it, we have to determine how much vaccine does it take to produce the proper response in the body, and how often do you have to take that? I mean, since I've got basically the bare basics of understanding this, I know that I get a tetanus vaccine and then I can go without it for another 10 years, but then I need to get a booster or get it renewed because otherwise it wears off. But I've heard a few people that we've talked to about this say, well, we don't know if you have to have the vaccine once or twice or 3 times. Do you have to have it once a year, or does it take 2 or 3 times a year? And how much do you give? Because I take it there's a problem with both giving too little or too much.
Sure. If you give too little, then obviously you're not going to develop enough of an immune response. If you give too much, then you start developing adverse reactions. And that's one of the things that they found out with the Moderna trials, which is the highest dose that they used. People started getting severe flu-like reactions, and that could be dangerous to someone who's susceptible to it.
You know, I noticed that, Dr. Pham, when I read through it, and they said, we're getting there and we're figuring this thing out. And then they said, oh, by the way, some of the side effects of the vaccine are fever, and they listed off all the symptoms of the China virus, it seemed like. And I thought, great, a vaccine in which you feel just as sick as you would have with China virus, except you're officially protected from China virus. That one made no sense to me at all.
Well, actually, a lot of the symptoms that you feel when you're sick, that's actually your body's immune response having an effect on you. So it's if you were sick without an immune system at all, you could go through almost the entire illness without feeling sick at all until the very end when the virus has taken over your body, essentially. So those ill symptoms, those flu-like symptoms that we're talking about, that is actually the immune response to the virus or to the vaccine. It's just that we don't want to over-generate it. Otherwise, we start running into some of the more severe disease that we were talking about with inflammation and all that.
Well, let's take it from the medical end of this to the diplomatic end. Is there a way for the U.S. government to address this? Because if Russia all of a sudden says, hey, we've come up with a vaccine, look at this, we didn't even have to work hard, we didn't break a sweat, and now we've got it. Is there any way for the U.S. government to challenge the Russians and say, if you, the Russian government, are going to allow companies within your country where they can control their companies to a far greater extent than the U.S. government can control private companies, if you're allowing or aiding and abetting your private companies and ripping us off, there are going to be consequences. Do you think that would do any good?
I'm not sure. So that was a very big question. So just starting off with the medical side of things, when a vaccine is released, then the scientific papers come out with it, describing what they did and what they used, what segment or what component they decided to use in the vaccine. So this Russia hacking is not the act of some Robin Hood thief trying to steal and give to the poor. This is them trying to get not just the data on the vaccine, which is going to be released sooner or later, but it's also the industrial data that's involved with the actual production of the vaccine. So the Russians they're not altruistic in this in the least bit. And so if they release something and they release the papers, then we'll be able to tell, one of our firms will be able to tell, hey, that's exactly what we did. And so we would know that that's basically what they just ripped off.
And isn't their answer, Dr. Pham, to that likely to be, yeah, we just happened to arrive at the same result as you did. It's science. So why would it be strange that we both, pursued the same goal and essentially did the same thing? It's like cheating on your homework, when you have to work the problem and show your work as well as the solution. The Russians can just show the solution and say, no mystery here. We just happened to go the same place all your scientists did. Prove that we stole it.
Right. Well, at least long division, there's only one way to do, or there's really one short way of doing it. But with a vaccine, then you're talking about how you're developing, whether you're doing recombinant DNA or you're growing it in other cells, or just reproducing the virus itself and then killing it in one way or another. So there are a lot of different ways of developing the actual vaccine, and if it looks identical to something that some other firm has been working on for a couple months now, then we'd have a pretty good idea of that.
I hope so. I hope that we're able to tell if they stole it from us, and then I hope that the U.S. government, through the State Department, let's say, goes after the Russians and says, if you're going to rip us off, we're going to find a way to take it out of your hide. We will get our pound of flesh one way or the other. Dr. Pham, thanks very much, and thanks for what you do at the Heritage Foundation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you on. That's Dr. Kevin Pham, who's a visiting policy analyst. Coming up, the left wants us to adopt $1 trillion, $2 trillion Green New Deal. But what do we do if green mega projects fail to sell with voters and citizens outside the big cities? I'll do that and your phone calls and emails coming up on the Lars Larson Show.